At dawn on April 7th, 1862, a group of Confederate officers stood on a low ridge in southern Tennessee and looked out at something that made grown men who had not flinched through a full day of combat go completely silent. The evening before, they had been celebrating. Their army had smashed into an unsuspecting Union camp, driven Federal soldiers back nearly 2 miles, and by nightfall, a telegram had already gone out to Richmond announcing a complete Confederate victory. Now, less than 12 hours later, those same officers were staring at a battlefield that should not have existed. Union soldiers stretched across the horizon in numbers that made no sense. Regiments that had not been there the day before, entire divisions that, by every scrap of Confederate intelligence, simply should not have arrived in time. What those generals said in that moment, quietly to each other, in the gray light before the second day of fighting at Shiloh began, is one of the most revealing exchanges in the entire Civil War, because it captures the exact instant a Confederate army understood it had already lost a battle. It thought it had already won. To understand why that sight on the morning of April 7th hit Confederate commanders as hard as it did, you have to go back roughly 36 hours to a Confederate army that had every reason to believe it was about to win one of the most complete victories of the entire war. General Albert Sidney Johnston commanded the Confederate forces gathered around Corinth, Mississippi, in early April 1862, and he was working against a clock that everyone in his command understood. Union General Ulysses Grant had roughly 40,000 men camped at Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River, and a second Union Army under Don Carlos Buell was marching from Nashville to join him. If the two Union forces combined, they would outnumber anything Johnston could realistically field. Johnston's entire strategic calculation rested on one narrow window: strike Grant's army before Buell arrived, destroy it or drive it into the river, and eliminate the threat before Union numbers became overwhelming. Confederate scouts and Johnston's own intelligence suggested Buell was still several days out. That estimate was about to prove catastrophically optimistic, though nobody in Confederate command understood that yet. The Confederate army that marched toward Pittsburgh Landing in early April was, by any honest assessment, not fully ready for what it was about to attempt. Many of the roughly 44,000 men in Johnston's command were recent recruits who had never fired a shot in anger. Rain had turned the roads to thick mud, slowing the march so badly that an attack originally planned for April 4th had to be pushed back 2 full days. Confederate officers, including General P.G.T. Beauregard, Johnston's second-in-command, argued at one point that the delay had cost them the element of surprise entirely, that Union pickets must have heard the noise of an army this large moving through the woods, and that attacking now meant attacking a Union force that was already alert and prepared. Johnston disagreed, and in one of the more famous exchanges of the campaign, reportedly told his officers that he would attack Grant's army if it took every man he had, because the alternative was watching that window close entirely once Buell arrived. Johnston's gamble on surprise turned out to be entirely correct, and the morning of April 6th delivered a shock to the Union Army that nearly ended the war in the Western Theater on its very first major engagement. Grant's soldiers at Pittsburgh Landing were, remarkably, not entrenched. Grant himself had judged that his men needed drilling more than digging, and Union pickets had reported only scattered contact with Confederate scouts in the days before the attack. Contact that Grant's subordinates largely dismissed as routine skirmishing rather than evidence of an approaching army. When Confederate infantry emerged from the tree line at dawn on April 6th and slammed into Union camps, still eating breakfast, the effect was close to total chaos. Entire Union regiments were overrun before they could form a proper line. Soldiers ran for the river in their shirt sleeves, weapons abandoned, tents still standing behind them with coffee pots left boiling over campfires that Confederate soldiers would eat from within the hour. By midday, the Confederate advance had driven Union forces back nearly 2 miles from their original camps, capturing prisoners, artillery, and supplies in quantities that seemed to confirm every optimistic assumption Johnston's command had made about catching Grant unprepared. The fighting was not uniformly one-sided. A section of the Union line near a sunken farm road, which soldiers on both sides would come to call the Hornet's Nest, held against repeated Confederate assaults for hours, buying critical time for Grant to organize a final defensive position near the river. But by late afternoon, that position had also been broken, and thousands of Union soldiers had been pushed back to a narrow strip of ground along the Tennessee River, their backs literally against the water, with Confederate forces pressing from 3 directions. It was in the middle of this advance, sometime around 2:30 in the afternoon, that the Confederate Army suffered a loss that would matter far more than anyone on the field understood in the moment. Albert Sidney Johnston, riding forward to personally direct an assault near a peach orchard in full bloom, was struck in the leg by a stray bullet that severed an artery behind his knee. Johnston, who had survived far more serious-looking wounds earlier in his career, apparently did not realize the severity of the injury and continued directing the attack for several minutes before the blood loss became impossible to ignore. He was helped from his horse and died within the hour, becoming the highest-ranking officer killed in action on either side during the entire Civil War. Command of the Confederate Army passed immediately to Beauregard, the same officer who had argued days earlier that the attack should be called off entirely because Surprise had already been lost. By nightfall on April 6th, Beauregard held a battlefield that looked, by every conventional measure available to him, like an overwhelming Confederate victory. His army had pushed the enemy back nearly 2 miles, captured thousands of prisoners, seized artillery pieces and supplies in enormous quantities, and pinned the remnants of Grant's army into a shrinking pocket along the river bank. Confederate soldiers, exhausted from a full day of fighting and drawn by the sight of abandoned Union camps stocked with food, coffee, and equipment far better than anything in Confederate supply lines, began looting those camps in significant numbers as organized attacks slowed toward evening. That looting would matter more than anyone realized at the time. Officers on both sides would later debate exactly how much this looting contributed to the loss of momentum in the final hours of daylight. But the practical effect was clear. The final push that might have driven Grant's remaining forces into the Tennessee River entirely did not happen before darkness made further coordinated attack impractical. Beauregard, operating from a captured Union tent that had belonged to a Federal officer hours earlier sent a telegram to Richmond that night announcing what he genuinely believed to be a complete and decisive Confederate victory. The message reflected honest confidence rather than propaganda. Beauregard had every reason, based on what his own eyes had witnessed that day, to believe the battle was effectively over and that mopping up the remaining Union resistance was simply a matter of resuming the attack the following morning. Confederate soldiers slept that night on a battlefield littered with the debris of what looked like total victory. Many of them convinced the campaign that would decide control of the Western theater had essentially already been won. What none of them knew, and what would transform the battlefield entirely before the sun rose again, was already underway on the river behind them. Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio had been marching hard toward Pittsburgh Landing for days, and by the evening of April 6th, its lead elements were close enough to hear the fighting. Buell's own troops began arriving at the riverbank as darkness fell, and throughout the night, steamboat after steamboat ferried fresh Union regiments across the Tennessee River to reinforce Grant's battered lines. This was the single detail Confederate intelligence had gotten wrong, and it was the detail that would decide the entire battle. Johnston's plan had depended on defeating Grant before Buell's army arrived. Buell's army arrived anyway, not days late, as Confederate estimates had assumed. But on the very night the first day's fighting ended in numbers substantial enough to completely restore what Confederate assaults had spent an entire day destroying. Adding to the reinforcement Grant received that night, General Lew Wallace's division, which had spent much of April 6th marching along the wrong road due to confused orders and arrived too late to participate in the first day's fighting, finally reached the battlefield after dark and took up position on the Union right. Between Buell's arriving corps and Wallace's delayed division, Grant's effective fighting strength by dawn on April 7th had grown to somewhere near 54,000 men, larger in total than the Confederate army had been at the start of the battle, and considerably larger than what remained of Beauregard's exhausted, depleted force after a full day of combat and the casualties it had already absorbed. Union gunboats on the Tennessee River spent the night firing intermittent shells into the Confederate positions closest to the water, a tactic that inflicted relatively little physical damage but denied exhausted Confederate soldiers the rest they desperately needed after a full day of fighting. Rain began falling sometime after midnight, turning the ground already churned by thousands of men and horses into thick mud, and Confederate soldiers who had slept in captured Union tents or simply collapsed where they stood woke that next morning, cold, wet, and still under the impression that they had won the battle the day before. What Confederate officers saw when the fighting resumed at first light was, by multiple first-hand accounts, close to disorienting. Union lines that should have been broken, retreating, or entirely destroyed based on the previous day's fighting were instead advancing, organized, fresh, and in numbers that immediately made clear something had gone fundamentally wrong with Confederate assumptions about the state of the enemy army. Confederate soldiers who had spent the previous evening looting Union camps and celebrating what they believed was a finished battle found themselves, within hours, fighting for their lives against an enemy that outnumbered them and showed no sign of the exhaustion or disorganization Confederate command had expected to still be exploiting. Beauregard, receiving reports of the scale of Union forces advancing against his lines, reportedly expressed open disbelief to the officers around him, unable initially to reconcile what he was being told with the victory he had telegraphed to Richmond only hours earlier. Confederate brigade and division commanders sent word up the chain of command describing Union numbers that contradicted everything Confederate intelligence had indicated about Buell's location and timeline, and the confusion in those early reports reflects genuine shock rather than simple battlefield exaggeration. Men who had watched an enemy army collapse the day before were now watching what looked, in the gray morning light, like an entirely different and much larger army occupying the same ground. Braxton Bragg, commanding one of the Confederate corps that morning, later described the psychological impact of the reversal in terms that went beyond simple tactical surprise. His men had gone to sleep believing the campaign was essentially decided in the Confederacy's favor, certain enough of victory that many had already begun writing home about it in letters that would never be sent once the second day's fighting made clear how completely the situation had changed. Waking to find fresh Union divisions advancing in strength forced an immediate and disorienting recalibration, not just of battlefield tactics, but of what officers had believed, as recently as the previous evening, they had already accomplished. The specific exchange that captures this moment most clearly took place among a cluster of Confederate officers observing the advancing Union lines from a rise near the Confederate position. Men who had fought and bled the day before to win ground that Union soldiers were now retaking with what seemed like minimal effort. One officer, according to accounts collected after the war, turned to the men beside him and asked where all these Federal soldiers had come from, since the army they had shattered the day before could not possibly have produced the force now advancing toward them. Another reportedly answered that this was not the same army at all, that Buell had arrived in the night, and that the Confederacy was no longer fighting the beaten remnant of Grant's command, but a combined force that outnumbered them outright. The realization moving through Confederate ranks that morning was not simply that the battle had turned. It was that the battle they believed they had already won the night before had, in the span of a few dark hours, become a battle they were now losing. Beauregard's Confederate army fought through most of April 7th in a defensive struggle that bore almost no resemblance to the previous day's confident advance. Ground that had been captured at significant cost on April 6th was surrendered again foot by foot as Confederate units that had already absorbed one full day of combat casualties found themselves facing fresh Union troops with far more capacity to sustain the fighting. By early afternoon, with his army running low on ammunition, exhausted beyond what further combat could reasonably demand, and facing a Union force that showed no sign of weakening, Beauregard made the decision that the previous day's telegram to Richmond had made almost unthinkable 12 hours earlier. He ordered a Confederate withdrawal back toward Corinth, Mississippi, conceding a battlefield his own dispatch had already declared won. The retreat itself was conducted with more order than the circumstances might have suggested, aided significantly by the sheer physical exhaustion on both sides that limited how aggressively Union forces could pursue a withdrawing enemy through mud and rain. Confederate rearguard actions, along with the general depletion of Grant's own army
after 2 days of the heaviest fighting the war had yet produced, meant Beauregard's forces reached Corinth largely intact as a fighting organization, even though the battle itself represented an unambiguous strategic failure for the campaign Johnston had designed. The casualty totals from the 2 days of fighting at Shiloh shocked observers on both sides in a way that no previous engagement of the war had approached. Combined losses across both armies exceeded 23,000 men, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. More American casualties in 2 days of fighting along the Tennessee River than the United States had suffered in all of its previous wars combined, including the Revolution, the War of 1812, and the war with Mexico, up to that point in the nation's history. Newspapers in both the North and South, accustomed to a war that had so far produced comparatively limited engagements measured in the hundreds or low thousands of casualties, struggled to find language adequate to the scale of what had happened along the Tennessee River, and the battle marked a genuine turning point in how both sides understood what the war would actually require, in blood and time, to bring to any kind of conclusion. For the Confederacy specifically, Shiloh represented the collapse of the exact strategic window Johnston had identified before the battle began. He had gambled everything on striking before Buell's army could combine with Grant's, understanding correctly that once Union forces in the Western theater achieved that combination, Confederate prospects in the region would deteriorate sharply. The gamble very nearly worked. Confederate forces came remarkably close to destroying Grant's army entirely on April 6th, closer than most Civil War engagements ever came to producing the kind of decisive, campaign-ending victory both sides spent the entire war searching for. What defeated that near success was not Confederate battlefield failure in the conventional sense, but the arrival, in a single overnight window, of exactly the reinforcement Johnston's entire plan had depended on preventing. Grant's own account of the battle, written years later in his memoirs, adds a detail that sharpens the contrast between what Confederate officers believed on the night of April 6th and what was actually happening around them. Grant described riding along his lines that night in the rain, checking on the condition of his battered army, and finding it in far better shape than the Confederate command across the field had any reason to assume. His forces had been pushed back, badly bloodied, and nearly broken in places, but they had not collapsed, and the arrival of Buell's leading divisions during the evening had already begun stabilizing a position that Confederate observers, watching from a distance in fading light, had reasonably assumed was finished. Grant later wrote that he never seriously considered retreat that night, a claim that some historians have treated skeptically given how desperate the Union position looked by late afternoon on April 6th. But the broader point holds, regardless of exactly how confident Grant privately felt. The Union Army Beauregard believed he had defeated was, by the time night fell, already receiving the reinforcement that would reverse the entire outcome. Sherman, commanding one of Grant's divisions and having weathered some of the heaviest fighting of the first day, later described the psychological experience of that overnight transition from Union perspective, and his account helps explain why the shift caught Confederate officers so completely off guard the following morning. Union soldiers who had spent April 6th in a fighting retreat, uncertain whether their army would survive the night, watched fresh troops arrive by the boatload throughout the evening, and felt the mood in their own ranks transform within hours, from something close to despair to genuine confidence. If that transformation was dramatic enough to be remembered decades later by the men who lived through it on the Union side, it is not difficult to understand why it produced such visible shock among Confederate officers encountering the results of it for the first time at dawn, with no warning and no time to process what had changed overnight. The human texture of that second morning deserves attention beyond the strategic summary, because the men on the Confederate side experiencing this reversal were not abstract military units on a map. Many had marched for days on short rations before the battle even began, fought a full day of the most intense combat most of them had ever experienced, and then spent the night on a battlefield covered with the dead and wounded from both armies, close enough to hear the cries of injured soldiers from both sides who had not yet been recovered. Confederate surgeons worked through the night, treating what wounded they could reach,
in conditions that offered little more than whiskey and improvised bandages for men whose injuries, by the standards of Civil War medicine, would often prove fatal regardless of treatment. Soldiers who woke that morning to discover the battle was not, in fact, already won, did so on almost no sleep, still carrying the physical and psychological weight of the previous day's combat, and now facing the prospect of fighting an enemy that had somehow grown stronger overnight rather than weaker. Confederate accounts from soldiers in the ranks, rather than the generals directing the battle, describe a specific kind of disorientation that the officers' more formal reports tend to understate. Men who had looted Union supplies the evening before, convinced the campaign was essentially over, found themselves that morning fighting with equipment scattered from celebration rather than organized for combat. Some units still recovering stragglers who had wandered off to examine captured Union camps rather than remaining in defensive positions. The gap between the Army's condition on the evening of victory and its condition facing renewed attack the following morning was not simply a matter of Union reinforcement. It reflected an army that had, in a very real sense, already stood down psychologically before the battle was actually finished, and that had to be reassembled under fire once the scale of the Union counterattack became clear. Historians have argued for more than a century over how much Johnston's death actually mattered to the battle's outcome, and the question connects directly to the shock Confederate officers experienced that second morning. Beauregard, who assumed command after Johnston fell, has been criticized by some accounts for not pressing the Confederate advantage more aggressively in the final hours of daylight on April 6th, when Union forces along the riverbank were at their most vulnerable and before Buell's reinforcements had fully arrived. Whether Johnston himself, had he survived, would have ordered a more complete final assault that evening remains one of the genuine unresolved questions of the battle. What is not in dispute is that the transfer of command during the most critical hours of the fighting added a layer of disruption to Confederate decision-making at precisely the moment when speed and decisiveness mattered most, and that disruption compounded with the exhaustion, looting, and general loss of momentum that already characterized the Confederate Army's final hours on the first day. The broader significance of what Confederate generals witnessed,
that second morning extends well beyond the immediate tactical reversal at Shiloh itself. The battle demonstrated in stark terms that both sides absorbed quickly that this conflict in the Mississippi Valley was not going to be decided by a single dramatic engagement, no matter how completely one side appeared to dominate on any given day. Confederate commanders who had experienced the shock of watching an apparently defeated enemy reappear overnight in greater strength than before learned a lesson that would echo through the rest of the war in that theater. Union numerical and logistical advantages meant that even the most successful Confederate tactical victories carried an expiration date, a window during which the advantage had to be exploited completely before Union reinforcement capacity erased it entirely. That lesson, learned in the worst possible way on the banks of the Tennessee River, would shape Confederate strategic thinking across that entire theater for the remainder of the war, informing decisions about when to press an advantage and when the risk of overextension against an enemy capable of rapid reinforcement outweighed whatever gains a battlefield victory might otherwise promise. There is one more piece of that morning worth returning to, because it captures something the strategic analysis alone cannot fully convey. Confederate officers surveying the advancing Union lines were not simply processing a tactical setback. They were processing the collapse of a story they had already told themselves and had already told Richmond about what the previous day's fighting meant. Beauregard's telegram announcing victory had gone out under his own name, based on his own genuine assessment of the battlefield as he understood it that night. Watching that assessment prove wrong within hours, in front of his own officers, and with no way to quietly retract what had already been sent, added a dimension of personal and professional exposure to the shock that a purely tactical reversal would not have carried on its own. Generals who had spent a day earning what looked like one of the Confederacy's most significant victories of the war were now watching that victory dissolve in real time, with the official announcement of it already on its way to the Confederate capital. The specific psychology of that moment, confident officers having already claimed success, suddenly forced to recalibrate in front of their own men, helps explain why so many first-hand accounts from Confederate participants describe the second day at Shiloh in terms closer to disbelief than ordinary battlefield frustration. Soldiers do not typically record simple tactical setbacks with the kind of vivid, specific memory that survives in letters and post-war accounts of that April morning. What survives instead is the sensory detail of the reversal itself. The sight of blue uniforms stretching further than anyone expected. The sound of fresh artillery opening fire from positions that should have been empty. The specific disorienting experience of realizing that an enemy army believed to be broken had, overnight and without warning, become larger and stronger than the army trying to finish it off. Shiloh's second day never produced the kind of decisive, war-altering outcome either side had spent the previous year hoping a single great battle might deliver. Beauregard's army survived its retreat to Corinth as a functioning fighting force, and Grant's reputation, despite having been caught unprepared on April 6th, survived scrutiny well enough that he would go on to command Union armies for the remainder of the war. But the exchange among Confederate officers on that ridge at dawn, the quiet disbelief passed between men who had celebrated victory just hours earlier, marks one of the clearest moments in the entire war where the actual balance of the conflict revealed itself in real time, stripped of the confidence and assumption that had carried Confederate command through the previous day's fighting. What these generals were looking at in that cold, wet dawn before the second day's fighting resumed was not simply a battlefield. It was the first hard evidence of something that would define the rest of the fighting west of the Appalachians, and eventually everywhere else Confederate armies faced Union forces backed by superior numbers and the logistical capacity to move those numbers quickly. Tactical brilliance, aggressive surprise, even the near total destruction of an enemy army in a single day of fighting, none of it mattered if the enemy could simply replace what had been destroyed faster than the winning side could exploit the advantage. Johnston had understood that brutal arithmetic well enough to gamble his entire army on beating it before it could catch up with him. And for most of one long bloody day in April, the gamble looked like it was going to pay off completely. His army came remarkably close to succeeding, closer than almost any other Confederate offensive of the entire war would come to actually breaking an enemy army beyond recovery. Right up until the reinforcements began arriving, that changed everything before the sun even came up. And the moment his officers looked out at those reinforced Union lines at first light on the second day was the exact moment they understood, without anyone needing to say it directly, that the gamble had failed by the narrowest and most painful margin the war had yet produced.